Bonjour, and welcome on the Gospel Spice podcast, where you are invited to taste and see that the Lord is good. Gospel Spice is your Christ-centered podcast, infused with in-depth biblical flavors and sprinkled with a dash of French culture to spice up your relationship with God. Here is your host, Stephanie Roussel, with a guest today.
Today is an episode unlike most others. It's the 450th episode of Gospel Spice, and we are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the American Republic. It also happens to be the first year, 2026, that my entire family has become American citizens. Our kids, my husband and I, it happened all this year. So this is a very important milestone for our family, for this podcast, for this country, and really in many ways for the world. And I'm saying that as a French citizen also, so not with a purely American perspective. To celebrate, we need to ponder and question. We need to look at the past and consider the futures. And who better to do this with than Os Guinness? He's been on the show before. He's a personal family friend. We love him and his wife Jenny dearly. I don't need to really introduce him, do I? But let me do that nonetheless. He's an author and social critic. Born in China during World War II, he witnessed the climax of the Chinese Revolution in 1949. Educated in England, he's a graduate of the University of London and Oxford. He has written or edited more than 30 books, and he lives with Jenny, his wife, in the Washington, D.C. area. That's a very low-key, understated biography for him. He's a very humble man. Honestly, every time we're together, I learn so much from his meekness, his humility, his incredibly witty, sharp insights. I really admire him deeply. I admire his perspective. And I was telling him after the interview that we had together today that part of the reason why our family chose to become American citizens is that we have learned to view the US largely through the lens of his books. We have read and studied so many of his books over the years. I've had him several times on the show. He deciphers for me where the United States of America are today in light of the past and as a launchpad for the future, as I mentioned. And so I really love how he analyzes, as a social critic, as an author, as a deeply believing Christian, how he analyzes what's happening in the US through the lens of scripture. He always brings it back to scripture. And his latest book, A Freedom Like No Other, which celebrates America 250, is no exception. In there, he widely discusses some of the most important issues that are facing the US today. He asked the question, what made America great in the first place? So we talked together about the foundations and the future of American freedom. He explains that to steward freedom, each generation, and ours right now, must understand, embody, and transmit the foundational ideas and virtues that made this American experiment possible. The survival of the Republic hangs on recovering this covenant vision. The lesson for Christians and for all freedom-loving citizens is very clear. Freedom isn't inevitable. And freedom definitely is not self-perpetuating. It requires gratitude for the biblical roots of the freedom we enjoy in this country. It requires courage to exemplify truth, virtue, responsibility, and commitment to pass these on to the next generation, which also means we need to have absorbed them for our own generation. As Oz says, our hope lies not in political maneuvering, but in recovering the profound, transformative truth of Scripture as the wellspring of true freedom. So, Os Guinness, welcome back on the Gospel Spice podcast.
Oh, great pleasure and privilege to be back with you.
You are so kind. It's always such a joy to have you on and to discuss the topics that you put forth in your books. So we are in the third of 4 books that you are writing for such a time as this, really. And so I want to talk about what made America great in the first place. That's the question you're trying to answer in the third installment of the 4 books of Freedom Like No Other. So what did make America great in the first place, Oz?
Well, let me just say why that's important. Because, there are many people, you take the whole MAGA movement, Make America Great Again. It's the strongest political movement of the day. Joe Biden talked about restoring the soul, but neither Biden nor Mr. Trump and his followers say what made America great in the first place. And that's the point. Because 250 years later, the Republic is truly a freedom like no other. And yet, 250 years later, through ignorance, through opposition, the American Republic is hardly talked about. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people talk about democracy. The framers didn't believe in democracy. And even the representative democracy in which they did believe has been switched now, as you have a lot of Democrat leaders talking about direct democracy. In other words, sheer numbers. And that's certainly not what the framers believed. So if the Republic is to survive, it will need people who appreciate it, who understand it, to stand for it. And that's the challenge behind this book.
I know it's going to sound like an obvious question to you, but help us understand the difference between a democracy and a republic as it is laid out in the American Constitution.
Well, there are many republics down through history. So you have the Roman Republic and you have the Renaissance republics and so on. But the American Republic is distinctive because it's not just a matter of having no king and therefore a republic, but the way they set up, the way freedom should be established and freedom should last. And the fact is that the American Republic comes from the Hebrew Republic, in other words, from Exodus and Deuteronomy, and that's why it's so distinctive. And the sad fact is that very few people understand that today. Even many who are Christians don't understand it. Now, at the time of the Revolution, as you know well, living in Philadelphia, they talked about the so-called Black Regiment. And that didn't mean the African American regiment, it meant the clergy in their black robes, because it was the preaching from the Bible, above all from Exodus and Deuteronomy, that gave the ideas that formed the revolution. And so Christians need to rediscover these and stand for these things. And the tragedy, as you know, is that faith has often become controversial and toxic today. And Christians are good at attacking what's wrong, but we're not doing a good job on putting in place what should be right. And the ideas that have come down from the Bible, for instance, at the time of the Revolution, what was the most cited book? It wasn't John Locke or Hobbes or Cicero or Machiavelli or Montesquieu, your great Frenchman. The most cited book at the time of the Revolution was Deuteronomy. Mm-hmm. Deuteronomy was the renewal of the Sinai covenant. And the whole of Deuteronomy is actually set out in terms of a covenant. And we as Christians have got to rediscover these things and stand for them proudly and gratefully, but understandingly.
You talk throughout many of your books about the fact that the West is becoming or has become a cut flower civilization because we have cut ourselves from our Christian roots that made us so unique. So you quote, I think it's Lincoln, right, who said that America was the last best hope for humanity. Yeah. So you say that 2026 might be the last best hope for the last best hope. How so?
1863, before he put out the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln, famous letter to the Congress, he said, America is the last best hope of Earth. Now, a little bit of hubris in that, and those of us from other countries might quarrel a bit, but there's no question today that is still largely true, because the Republic is the only free society that is a genuine counter to the menace of our day, which is global authoritarianism. Putin in the west of Eurasia, Xi Jinping in the east, and so on. The trend is towards authoritarianism. And you can see authoritarianism on the left in this country, cultural Marxism. You can see authoritarianism coming from radical Islamism. You can see authoritarianism coming even from the right. And the administration, too much, in my view, relies on power to do things rather than persuasion. So the Republic, as it was set up, is the world's only counter. Now, I think that means in 2026, the 250th anniversary, this is a wonderful chance. We have a baseline, the Revolution, 1776. We have a benchmark, 250 years later, and people should be saying, where are we? How are we doing? Are we really doing well? And if not, what do we need to renew and restore and replace? So I think 2026 is the last best chance. Humanly speaking, you've got to say, the Lord might have quite different ideas. humanly speaking, it's the last best chance for the last best hope.
So freedom. So you talk about, the 21st century leading towards some kind of showdown between authoritarianistic countries and not, if there are any left that aren't. But that's further down the line. I was just finishing reading your book, A Freedom Like No Other, in which you say that the immediate challenge for Americans today is not actually immediately today the threat of authoritarianism. That's further down the line, because we have an even more pressing concern, which is a misunderstanding or a complete forgetting of freedom and what it means and what it really is. So you talk about the first principles of American freedom and how that's really what's at stake here, because we're not just at risk of losing the fight against authoritarianism unless that won't even be a fight if the US doesn't recover that sense of these first principles of American freedom. So I want to talk about that. But before we do that, and that's a question you address in the book, talking about principles and ideas, how is that actually essential and more important than talking about practical ways to solve problems? Why are ideas and intentions absolutely crucial right now?
Well, America is a nation by intention and by ideas. And so, as all the great political thinkers realized, Plato, Montesquieu, and so on, you have to begin with the principles before you go to the policies. Now, the trouble is today, most of the political discussion surrounds the policies. We don't like this policy or that policy, or outraged by this, and we're opposed to that, and so on. But actually, the problems come with the principles. You mentioned earlier the idea of the cut flower civilization. So you just take the very notion of freedom itself. What's the foundation for freedom? And how does it last? Well, on both those two questions, the Bible is very, very distinctive, unique. Our atheist friends, our secularists, whether France or Britain or here in the US, there isn't a secularist thinker who believes in freedom. They all believe in determinism. Different forms, for Marx, economic, for Freud, psychological, gone down the line. The ancients believed in fate. Modern secularists believe in determinism. No freedom. Freedom actually comes from the Bible, the Jewish and Christian understanding of people made in the image of God. But then you take another question. How is freedom to last? Freedom always runs out in the sands, and liberty becomes license. Mm-hmm. So for freedom to last, and the framers discussed this endlessly, they didn't give a name for their solution. I call it the golden triangle of freedom. Freedom requires virtue. Virtue requires faith. Faith requires freedom, which requires virtue, and so on. It goes right like the recycling triangle, round and round forever. Now, modern Americans have abandoned or attacked all three of those. Who wants virtue? Now, virtue means honesty, loyalty, trust, and so on. Free societies depend on trust. Authoritarian societies depend on fear. And of course, the moderns attack faith, and now increasingly they're attacking religious freedom. So each of the legs of the triangle have been opposed, which means very simply, freedom won't last. And Jenny always reminds me from the story in the Titanic, the film. And you remember there's a point at which the captain and the engineers and people are coming, they roll out the designs of the ship, and they wonder how many of the tanks can survive, the ship will survive if the tanks are breached. And the engineer, who knew it well, he points out that the ship is iron and too many have been breached. And the lady says, "You mean we're going to sink?" "Yes, madam. The ship is iron. It will sink. It's a mathematical certainty." Now, equally, you can look at history. Unless you do certain things with freedom, freedom simply won't last. And the way Americans are living with freedom today, freedom will die. There's no foundation. There's no framework. freedom will die. It's a mathematical certainty. So some of these things, Americans have got to think much more clearly. As you know, I'm an admirer of this country, but I wish people would wake up. It's much later than people realize.
Actually, I would say to the point that some people don't even cherish freedom anymore, that it's gotten to a place where some other values might be considered more important. So briefly, remind us why freedom is what made America unique and the success that it is, or it has been.
Well, you take the ideas that are challenging this today. I call it the Red, Green Alliance. You see 50-odd years of the rise of a cultural Marxism. Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, you see, particularly after October the 7th, the convergence of cultural Marxism with radical Islamism. And both of those are openly opposed to freedom. And they, of course, gaslight the whole American experiment. It's only racist, homophobic, genocidal, and so on. So you've got now increasing number of leaders, the mayor of New York, and you've gone down the line. The candidate in New England who has a Nazi tattoo on his chest, and you've gone down the line. America is radically infiltrated with people who disagree with the American experiment. And clearly that is suicidal, and freedom won't last. Mm-hmm. Now, the challenge for the world is, can we create societies with a high view of human dignity and a high view of freedom? Because really, human beings long for freedom. And without the principles of the Republic, which are biblical principles, they won't survive here, and they're not surviving well elsewhere. Europe, as you know well, is going rapidly down the tubes. You know, my own country, Britain, has been in the forefront of standing. We were the first to pioneer religious freedom. Now, sadly, freedom in England was the lost cause. It failed. The English Republic lasted 10 years and collapsed. And freedom went on with a weak conscience and things like that, the nonconformist conscience. But in England and France and many other European countries, freedom is declining rapidly. So it's very tragic that America, the most free country still, is not realizing what's happening.
Obviously, our family moved to the US about 10, 12 years ago, but we've had ties with the US for over 30 years, with my story of coming to the US as a teenager, as an atheist, and coming to faith here. And for many years, my husband and I, we would come to the US and we would always say, it's kind of like crossing through the wardrobe into Narnia. It's like we're entering a different country. And for many years, he and I were trying to put words to what is it about the American mindset and worldview. And I mean, outside, I don't mean from a Christian perspective, just people in general. What is it that makes Americans different? We could sense a general belief in the ability to do good and an appreciation of freedom that he and I had never really experienced before. And so for many years, we tried to put words on what it was that made this American experiment. And yes, of course, it boils down to the Christian faith and the virtues that actually, as I was reading your book, one virtue after another that you describe, you picked 12. I think it nailed for me what it was that I was sensing in the American mindset that made it absolutely unique, and that I think we are seeing disappearing in the last 10, 15 years, increasingly. So as we, from our tiny little vantage point, as we have seen it over the last 30 years, it's a much grander story, obviously, of 250 years. But what we have seen in this little capsule of time in the last 30 years of the vanishing of these virtues, I find terrifying. And I don't want to say hopeless, because you're not hopeless, but it's really hard to hope that these virtues will win the day in the end. So what I'd love for us to do together is go through a few of the ones that you've described. So you describe that initially, obviously, freedom had to be acquired, right? That is in the early stages of the American Republic. And then it had to be ordered. That's the Constitution very early on. And then ever since, it has had to be maintained one generation after another. And as you know, the Israelites clearly say, we're only one generation away from forgetting who we are and our identity. So the work of sustaining the freedom that has been acquired and ordered is the project for every generation. So I'd love for us to look at a couple of examples for each and help us maybe understand what our place is in our generation right now, and how as Christians we can be part of the chance to recover freedom in this country for the last best hope of the world, really, of humanity, of Earth, as you said. So with this said, if that's okay, I'd love to talk a bit more on, you did talk already about freedom, but specifically one of the virtues you highlight is liberty. And I specifically loved how you tied it to free will and God's freedom and the restraints he puts on himself because we are created in his image as creatures of free will. Would you take us there for a minute, please?
Well, that's a deep one. People blame the Lord for authoritarianism. But the Jews rightly point out all authority is ultimately God's. But he creates people in his image. And in a divine act of humility and self-limitation, the Lord will never invade the human heart. So he gives us freedom to choose. Now, people actually think of that. You take the evangelical love for Holman Hunt's picture of the light of the world, or the verse in Revelation 3, behold, I stand at the door and knock. In other words, the picture and that verse underscore there's no handle on the outside of the door. It has to be on the inside. The one place God will never invade is individual human choice. We are responsible for our choosing. Now, that's a very radical idea. And we need to point out the significance of that, the way we, stand for liberty in all sorts of areas. But, of the 12, the two I stress most are that one of them, the framers were not very good at. And the other one is one that we're not very good at today, although the framers were. So the one they were not good at is reciprocity.
Yes.
Which is
I want to talk about that.
Everything.
Yeah.
For the Jews, you love your neighbor as yourself. There was a reciprocal responsibility of everyone for everyone. The notion, every Jew responsible for every Jew. Now, that should have meant, when we believe that God's created us all equal, that should have meant the end of slavery. And
Absolutely.
in the 18th century, people like Samuel Johnson in England pointed that out. The Americans were, as he put it, yelping about freedom and driving their Negroes, as Johnson put it. So the framers, really, that was the original sin.
Yes.
The contradiction, the compromise at the heart of the Constitution, sadly. Now, there's one, though, which they were good at, and we aren't, which is the later one, civility. How we talk with public discourse. So biblically, we should speak always with a strong view of words, a strong respect for people made in the image of God, and a strong regard for truth. And yet American discourse today, led by the president himself, is an absolute disgrace. And you have locker room language now from the highest levels, including the White House. Whereas the Bible, the Jews have a wonderful notion, an argument on behalf of heaven or an argument not on behalf of heaven. So if you argue for truth and you win, both sides win because you've established truth. But if you argue only to win, in other words, power, victory, both sides lose because might has become right and power has overcome truth. Now, we as Christians, we should stand against the president and leaders who talk like that. We should be concerned to reform language. And so, yes, of course, we thank the president for this policy, that policy, immigration, for example. Thank you, Mr. President. That was good. But we should have the courage to say when he departs from the biblical way, Mr. President, watch your language. You're corrupting American freedom by your incivility. And the same is true of social media across the board. And so you've got preachers who swear in the pulpit and so on. I mean, this is terrible. Christian discourse is a key contribution to freedom. And we've got to be in the vanguard of reforming the country.
Out of respect for the Lord, for ourselves, and for each other. Absolutely. Yeah. And truth as the bastion for respect and freedom is absolutely essential. You are part of an amazing documentary and movie about that recently, aren't you?
Truth Rising, yes.
Yes, Truth Rising. Phenomenal, by the way. Yes.
Thank you.
You talked about reciprocity and civility. These are examples of self-restraint as one of the hallmarks of true freedom, right? As God, as you said, as God has showcased in restraining his own freedom to allow us to become part of the dance of the Trinity in many ways, right? So these are, I want to touch base on morality as well, that you mentioned as one of the virtues, because morality is another one that has completely gone down the drain, I think.
Yeah.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, but the thing is that there's no such thing as common sense or self-evident things when it comes to character or ethics anymore. How are our private lives as Christians the foundation for the public discourse, or should be? And same for anyone in a position of leadership. You said that we have to be careful of the wolves at the door, but even more the termites in the floor. That sentence just struck me. So when it comes to morality, tell us about the termites in the floor as being more dangerous than the wolves at the door.
Well, people rightly quote the old saying that, vigilance is the eternal price of liberty. And they think by that vigilance, we got to look for the external foes, China, Russia, whatever it is, terrorists. No, the real thing we have to be vigilant about are the internal problems, and they always come first, and they're usually the major ones. So you take morality. Freedom is a moral accomplishment. So you ask about morality, most people dismiss it altogether today, or say it's purely private. And they will say, what we need is the rule of law. That's true. The rule of law is morality at the public level legalized. But for the framers, you didn't just rely on the rule of law. You relied on the role of character and the role of ethics in private. And you need the two, not just the rule of law. Otherwise, you'll use the rule of law as a weapon, weaponize it, and attack your enemies. People did that against Trump in the Democrats. And now Trump's doing it against his enemies. So the rule of law by itself is just an expression of power. That you need the rule of law and the role of character and ethics in private and public life in ordinary people. Because freedom is really a moral accomplishment. You have to grow in freedom like you grow in expertise piano playing or basketball playing or whatever. It's not something you're either free or not free. No, you grow more and more free by growing responsible and so on. So freedom requires morality, and we need to get over the enormous prejudice people have against morals. No one's imposing it on anyone else, but if you want freedom to last, it has to be a moral task and a moral achievement.
As opposed to the prevalent hypocrisy of public image that seems to be all that matters, whether it be, on a small scale on social media or on a bigger scale in the political arena. You talk towards the end of your book of the French expression amour propre, the idea of the love of self, but through the lens of public approval. And what matters is not so much in our culture currently. What matters isn't so much who I really am in the secret parts and when no one is watching, but is what people perceive of me to be. And that is extremely dangerous. That is the opposite of truth, therefore of trust. And when we care more about the public appearance and don't mind hypocrisy over truth and morality, it somehow absolves us from the responsibility to be trust builders and truth bearers. So going back to the US Constitution, I found so many of your insights in this book really interesting when it came to the US Constitution as someone who has not grown up with it at all. The fact that it's a mutual responsibility made by all Americans to all Americans, and by extension to the rest of the world who hasn't been experiencing this level of freedom. Tell us how responsibility is this mingling of freedom and high trust. And that requires this morality and the expression of all the virtues. The responsibility, I think, American citizens have to one another and to the world in many ways.
The Constitution and the Declaration together come from the Hebrew covenant, and it was a promise. The Lord proposes it, and the people respond. All that the Lord says, we will do. It's a promise they made to him and to each other. So unlike, say, the Middle Eastern covenants between a chieftain and a chieftain, or a king and a king, no. You have 600,000 covenants, as the Hebrews put it. In other words, each Jew, or the Israelite, making a covenant to every other Israelite. Now, in the same way, covenant became constitution, we the people. And it was understood as a promise. You can see that in Frederick Douglass. You can see it famously in Martin Luther King. So in his famous I Have a Dream speech in 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial, he said he's come as a Black to cash in the, quote, promissory note of the covenant. It promised this, it didn't cash it in. And all these years later, it was time for the African Americans to cash it in. That was right. The covenant is a promise to every single citizen that they have certain rights and certain responsibilities. And so we need to go back to the promise-making part of it.
The humility to acknowledge when the original sin, in this case, the American slavery, has taken place and has fallen short of the constitutional ideal. And that takes us back, we could go full circle back to civility and reciprocity, as you said. It all of these virtues inform and color. And it's kind of like a recipe where the more you add ingredients, the more they work together to give the desired flavor that you're looking for. Tell us about fidelity. I loved that one. It's the last one. I think it's the one it's kind of the overarching one to sustain the freedom that has been acquired. So how is fidelity, the call to remember, the transmission of the covenant, how is that completely forgotten and absolutely essential to recover?
Well, I love the way the rabbis put it. You take the liberation of Exodus. The night of the Passover, after 400 years, they're going free tonight. But Moses never mentions freedom. And where are they going? To the land of milk and honey, the promised land. He never mentions it. But 3 times Moses talks about what? Children. Because it's the story we tell to our children that is the key to identity and the key to continuity. Now, that means that public education, or education of all sorts, is critical in families, in schools, in churches and synagogues, and so on. Now, take American education. It used to be that the public school were where people were integrated into what it meant to be American. It was the melting pot. Then came Howard Zinn and his alternative view of history, and more recently, the 1619 Project. Now, they are gaslighting America. They undermine the understanding of America. No, quite simply, they are suicidal for the Republic. Every generation has to pass it on, and that's why freedom is always one generation away from ending. President Reagan said that in his inaugural address, and so on. So the transmission of what it means to be a citizenship. Now, in the 19th century, Tocqueville, the great Frenchman, he described the churches as schools of citizenship. They're not today. The churches have failed and schools have failed. Transmission is breaking down, and you find many, many young people who are patriots, they haven't a clue about what made the Republic.
How is that a very dangerous situation for the US to be today, as this generation has the power to make America a city on a hill again, or, as you say, a byword for future generations?
Well, that's the Bible, of course, as well as John Winthrop on the Arbella. And covenantalism and promise-making is always conditional. If you do this, there are certain consequences. If you do that, there are other consequences. So people like to quote the first half. President Reagan often used to talk about America as a city on a hill. if successful. But many Americans don't go on to say, but if not successful, will be a byword and a protest and a proverb. In other words, failure. And you look at America today, we're nearly 6 months into the 250th anniversary. I have not heard a single leader yet refer to the Republic as it was founded. There may have been people I've missed, but certainly not from the highest levels. The hour is much later than people realize. Now, the Republic can collapse. And America could be a democracy, increasingly a democracy in name only. You look at all the shenanigans surrounding California elections. But even democracy could collapse. America would still be a strong superpower. So I'm not saying America's going to collapse overnight, no. But the Republic is what's distinctive. That's the best counter to authoritarianism. That's why I'm fighting for the restoration of the Republic. And the hour, as I keep saying, is later than most Americans think.
Not to equate the US to Israel or the church in any way at all. But Jesus did say, if you lose your first love, I will spit you out of my mouth because you're neither hot nor cold. It sounds a bit like that, doesn't it? Forgetting the first love.
That was the church.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
I'm saying, that's what I'm saying. I'm not equating the two, but I'm saying it kind of has a bit of those overtones of this is a momentous precipice that has strong consequences.
Yeah, the conditionality is the same. The choice is the same. The conditions are the same. But we've got to be clear, there's so much confusion. You take the recent 250 Rededicate rally. Christians spoke with such confusing terms that the controversies surrounding that rally have been incredible. And there's chaos. The Hebrew Republic was a covenant with God. The Lord was a partner. That's why it's so distinctive. It's unique. The American Republic is not a covenant with God. But as Abraham Lincoln and others pointed out, it's a covenant under God. In other words, it's a covenant between Americans as to how to run the country, but under God because Americans are accountable. Lincoln was very clear. The Civil War was God's scourge on America for chattel slavery. And you can see that maybe the chaos of today is God's scourge on the country just for leaving his ways, where we're reaping the consequences. The moral degeneracy is unbelievable in America. Now we see fraud, billions wasted, fraud and waste on a colossal scale. Surely people see the importance of honesty
and accountability and the acknowledgement of fallibility, as you mentioned in the book. So there's so much. I wish we could have more time together, but highly recommend clearly, reading through your book slowly, digesting it. There's a lot there. So is the sun rising or setting on the US?
Well, that's a wonderful story because, as you know, Ben Franklin used to look at the chair in which George Washington sat as the president of the Constitutional Convention. And on the back of the chair, you've got it there in Philadelphia, is a sun. And he was never quite sure if it was setting or rising. But then when the Declaration was signed, he said he was sure now that it was rising. But I would say that while America has flourished over 250 years, what will come out of the 2026? Will there be a restoration of the Republic or not? If the Republic, as the framers founded it, with the corrections, say, of reciprocity and slavery and so on, if the Republic is restored, then the sun can continue high in the heavens for America. But if America fails to restore the Republic, you will begin to see the acceleration of American twilight and decline. And as it said in the Titanic, that's a mathematical certainty.
That is a hefty responsibility on the shoulders of this generation in this moment. Paint for us a picture of unbridled power without principle as the counter reality to covenant freedom.
Well, I said earlier, that's the global menace of the day. You think of Nietzsche's last words in his last book, published posthumously, the very last words. Do you want a name for my world? This world is the will to power and nothing besides. In other words, power without principle. You can see that running through history. You can see it supremely in Rome. And the scriptures, and above all, the gospel, reverse that. You know, the wonderful conversion of someone like the great historian Tom Holland. What brought him to the Lord was not the resurrection, which for so many people is the clincher. It was the cross and power. Because the cross is the great subversion of unprincipled, unbridled power. And the tragedy is that the president himself and many on the right, certainly most on the left, are going back the way of unprincipled, unbridled power. Now, of course, that's what the revolution, the American Revolution, is against. That's why you have checks and balances, separation of powers, which comes out John Witherspoon to James Madison, ambition to counteract ambition, so on and so on, because of the danger of power. You've got to contain power. It's like the cladding around a nuclear fusion. And yet America's abandoning the brilliance of that idea and going back towards power. Executive orders, you take, say, I personally 100% agree with President Trump closing the border. Absolutely necessary. But he should have done it persuasively and explaining why that was important to citizenship. Don't just do something. You persuade what you explain what you're doing persuasively in line with the criteria of citizenship. So he just creates a reaction against himself. It was power without persuasion.
The end never justifies the means.
Never.
The civility of public discourse as opposed to just the expression of power. Thanks for the example with Tom Holland. In that vein, in light of all of this, so you've written so many books, increasingly raising the alarm against the direction you see the US going. Where do you rest your hope today in 2026?
Turn around everything I've said. If the genius and the best of American high views of dignity, the best of American truth and freedom, and all these things we've been arguing, where do they come from? The Bible, the Jewish and Christian scriptures. Those of us who love God should be excited out of our skins with the wonder and the brilliance and the freedom and the profundity of the truths in Scripture. Why aren't we? You know, this is the 500th anniversary of Tyndale's translation of the New Testament, the first in English from the original Greek into English. It was explosive. It led to freedom. It led to the Bible and then to the Reformation, then to freedom. So this heritage is incredible. It's all there in the gospel. Why are Christians so cowardly in many cases, or arguing in ways that are not arguing for the essential truths that are positive? You know, the answers are all, why am I hopeful? Because of the Bible, because of the gospel, because of the Lord.
We need to recover.
You know, Stephanie, one of the most chilling statements in the French Revolution was Robespierre, who says a single will is necessary. Well, that leads directly to authoritarianism and the reign of terror. Now, a single will is necessary, the Lord's, but he's not authoritarian. We go back to what we were saying earlier. He made people in his image and gives us freedom even to choose against him. So freedom is a very precious idea, but all the deepest principles of it are there in the scriptures. And we should be grateful and just, as I said, excited out of our skins at the privilege and miracle of the truths that we're the guardians of.
It has to do with remember that delighting in God is the key to everything, isn't it? So that's a topic I'm very passionate about. When we delight in the Lord, he does remind us that he is the source of all our delight, indeed. And when we remember who he is and what he has done for us, and when we remember the depth of freedom he has given us, that is truly the most transformative thing. Whom the sun sets free is free indeed.
Indeed.
Right? Oh, Oz, I think we'll need to end with that. Thank you so much for your time, for writing this next book, which you said you weren't expecting to write, right? It kind of came out of nowhere. And I'm so glad that you were inspired to write it. And I can't wait for the fourth and final, which will be a deep dive in some of the things you discussed.
Well, number 5 is the Christian response, which will be the toughest of all, but not part of the quartet.
Okay. All right. Well, then 2 more to look forward to at least. Thank you. Os Guinness, thank you so much for being with us today, for writing this book, for opening it for us. Thank you.
My privilege. Thank you.
Hi, Jonah here. Thank you for being part of the Gospel Spice family. If you've enjoyed this episode, you will love receiving our newsletter. It contains value-packed free gifts and rich content each month. It's at gospelspice.com/sign-up. There is always something new and exciting happening around here, and I don't want you to miss out. Sign up at gospelspice.com/sign-up. Did you know Gospel Spice has a YouTube channel? There's exclusive content there too, so join Gospel Spice on YouTube. Also, please give us a star rating and a comment on your podcast listening app. Your reviews actually really do make a difference to help others discover and experience Gospel Spice. As always, we are praying for you. You can confidentially email us your prayer requests and praise items at the email address contact@gospelspice.com. It's our privilege to pray for you. So, I'll leave you with 4 things to do. Please pick one and do it at your convenience. 1. Sign up on our website for our newsletter to receive gifts you're going to love. 2. Find us on YouTube and see what content we've put together to help you grow closer to Jesus. 3. Rate Gospel Spice on your listening app. It's one of the easiest ways to share the gospel. And finally, 4. Tell us how we can pray for you. Merci.